Okay, hello. In this week's two sessions, we're looking at two very interesting countries, very unusual countries that had, in the period that we were interested in, quite separate paths from the rest of the communist bloc, from the rest of of Eastern and Central Europe. Those countries are Yugoslavia and Albania. So in this session, I want to talk a little bit about Yugoslavia, talk about what happened to Yugoslavia during the Second World War, talk about the communist revolution in Yugoslavia, which was quite a bit different from the revolutions, the seizures of power that we looked at in the last session, which were mainly political. In Yugoslavia, the communist takeover of power was a military, was a national revolution, a guerrilla warfare. So we'll talk about that. And I want to talk about the first significant break in the communist bloc, in the Eastern Bloc. We saw last time, didn't we, how Stalin at the end of the Second World War, for various reasons, decided to consolidate and to sort of expand his empire into Eastern and Central Europe, and that ultimately this meant that the countries that we were interested in became communist states, communist government governed and under the control of Stalin. This is the case of Yugoslavia. What happens to the country in 1948 is the first significant break, and certainly not the last, but the first significant break that takes place within the Soviet bloc. Yugoslavia breaks away from the Eastern Bloc, remains a communist country, but goes out onto its own path. So we're going to talk a little bit about how and why that happened. And Yugoslavia, of course, is a country that we'll be coming back to at great length later on when we talk about the kind of socialism, the kind of communism that Yugoslavia adapted, evolved in Yugoslavia, and of course ultimately when we talk about the conflicts that broke up the country in the 1990s. Now, in the second session, we're talking about Albania, which is also a very interesting country. Its communist revolution was also a military revolution during the Second World War, and its path, for various very convoluted and very complex reasons that we will discuss at length in the second session, was also a separate one, and little Albania became, kind of an outlier in the Cold War as well. So two countries that are both communist, that remained communist throughout the Cold War, but nevertheless had quite a different experience of revolution, but also of communism going forwards. And I'm going to try to explain how and why that happened. Now, to begin with, let's go then to the slideshow. Both Yugoslavia and Albania are part of the region known as the Balkans. And I put up a small map there, which gives you a sort of a sense of what the Balkans are, what the Balkans were. The Balkans. So you can see on this map in the top left hand corner the countries and the states that comprise the Balkan region. So this is kind of southeastern Europe, everything from, let's say, maybe Croatia, Bosnia, through to Serbia, Montenegro, across to Romania and Bulgaria, and down into Albania, Montenegro, and Greece. So this sort of region to the east of the Adriatic, so between the Adriatic and the Black Sea, and at the bottom the Mediterranean. So the Balkans, there is also, I've put up in this picture a very good book, a very short book, by way of introduction, a book by a historian called Mark Mazower, which is indeed called The Balkans, and introduces you to the key sort of ideas, the key themes of the Balkan region. Now, the Balkan region is very complex and a very interesting sort of cultural space and geographical space, and I'll try to collapse all of the complexities down to just one or two of the key points. But if you are interested in going further, Mark Mazower's book is still in print, or you can buy it very very cheaply secondhand. At this stage, it would only cost like €4 or €5. There are a lot of secondhand editions out there because it's on a lot of university courses. So there's a lot of books in circulation, and that gives you a very good overview, a very good introduction of the region. I guess for the time being, I would just say maybe two key points. The first is the very obvious one you can see from this map, the physical geography of the Balkans. It's extremely mountainous terrain, throughout Bosnia, throughout Bulgaria, throughout large parts of Serbia, Montenegro, and Albania. Much of this is sort of mountainous terrain, which means it's very easy on the one hand. It's very difficult on the one hand for great empires in history to sort of control and conquer the region in completely, and this goes right up to the end of the Second World War. And on the other hand, it's very easy to sort of wage insurgent warfare, wage guerrilla warfare, and we'll see that becomes quite an important point when we talk about what happened in Yugoslavia and Albania during the Second World War. Now, the other thing I suppose I guess that the key experience of the Balkan region, as far as we're concerned, I put this in slide 2. The key sort of experience going forward is that of the Ottoman control, Ottoman Empire. From the medieval period right up until the 19th century, in some cases, right up until the 20th century. So in the cases of places like Macedonia and Kosovo, the experience of the Balkan region was one of being controlled by the Ottoman Empire. The Balkans were part of the Ottoman Empire from sort of the 14th century onwards. As we get into the modern period, particularly the 19th and the 20th centuries, the Ottoman Empire is starting to weaken, and therefore its control over the Balkans is gradually loosening and gradually becoming weaker and weaker. Nevertheless, for many centuries, the Balkans were controlled by the Ottomans. Now, this means, of course, many things. There's a different sort of, from the different kind of foods that they would eat, certain traditions, language, the Serbian language, the Bosnian language is shot through with, with Turkish loan words, words that have sort of just entered into the vocabulary over the centuries from Turkey. It means that there's a strong sort of, Islamic flavor. If you go to a country like Bosnia, or if you go to a country like Albania, or perhaps some parts of Bulgaria, you would see sort of mosques, medreses. You would still see the legacies of the Ottoman Empire, although in the 19th and the 20th century, when these countries decolonized from the Ottomans, very often they tried to sort of erase this memory of the Ottoman, the so-called Ottoman presence. Now, the Ottoman Empire was very weak in the 19th and the 20th century. It was called the sick man of Europe. And it looked very clear to the great powers that the Ottoman Empire was retracting from the Balkans, and that the Balkans would become independent. They would sort of break away from empire. They would become post-colonial spaces. But nevertheless, it was not always the case. And if we go back to the early modern period, the Ottoman Empire was not at all the sick man of Europe. In fact, it was one of the most powerful dynasties on the global sphere, particularly in the 16th century, and particularly under the reign of the Sultan Suleiman, who was known as Suleiman the Magnificent, and in fact that's what his enemies called him. So you can imagine, to be called, what we call our enemies now is just quite different from of course, from what people called Suleiman. So once upon a time, the Ottoman Empire was an extremely powerful empire, and its economic system, its religious system, its political system, its economic system imposed themselves upon the Balkan region, and the legacies of all of those things are still very potent up until the 20th century. Now, one of the key legacies going forwards, we won't talk about it so much in today's class, but in future, particularly when we come to the wars of the 1990s, one of the key legacies of the Balkan, one of the key legacies of the Ottoman presence, the presence of the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans, was a very large number of Slavs who converted to Islam. Now, nobody's really sure how this happened. It's still a relative mystery, and medieval historians and historians of the early modern Balkans have competing theories. Various theories have come in and out of fashion. Nobody really has a sort of comprehensive answer. There's not a consensus on how these conversions took place. It's quite a strange thing to happen because the Ottoman Empire was not a proselytizing empire. It did not force people, unlike, for example, the Holy Roman Empire or the Russian Empire. It did not force people to change religion. It did not force Christians, even though these territories were occupied and conquered by the Ottoman Empire. In most cases, the Ottomans were willing to let the Christians, let the Jews, let the other religious confessions within the empire basically live on their own terms. They weren't sort of forced to convert. So people did this voluntarily. They could do this for a number of reasons. Just to sort of rise up in the Ottoman hierarchy. There were certain jobs and certain positions which were not open to non-Muslims. There was certain taxation, certain regulations which they could escape from if they were part of the Islamic group, part of the Muslim group within the Ottoman Empire. But what this, essentially nobody really knows what this meant. But in practice, the fact is that there were very many Christians who converted to Islam within the Balkans, and those were in the largest number of those were in places like Bosnia, in places like Albania, and in places like Western Bulgaria. Now you can imagine that those people, when the Christian states decolonized in the 19th and the 20th centuries, when they broke free of the Ottoman Empire, in many cases, those Slavs who had converted, their forefathers and foremothers had converted to Islam, were looked upon with great sort of suspicion. And there was a sense in the nationalist thinking in the 19th and the 20th century Balkans, and there still is to this day, that those people who converted are somehow sort of apostates, that they had been Christians, that they had turned away from the true faith, and that maybe they should be sort of brought back to it, if by force, if necessary. So a number of very important legacies of the Ottoman Empire: architectural, cultural, linguistic, economic. But one of the key ones, one of the most important legacies, is the legacy of this large sort of Islamic presence, which remained after the Ottoman Empire disappeared from the Balkans. And again, that's a very brief overview, but if you want more information on this, I urge you to go and look at Mazawa's book, because this gives an extremely fair-minded and extremely balanced view of the Balkans. Okay, so let's now talk for the remainder of the session about Yugoslavia, and we're now turning to slide number 3. So Yugoslavia was one of these states that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. The Yugoslav state was formed at the end of the First World War. It came together from various territories that had, until 1918, been separated. Now, the state, of course, was a state of the South Slav people, and indeed, Yugoslavia essentially means South Slavia. Yugo in Slavonic languages, most Slavonic languages, means South, and Slav means Slav. So Yugoslavia is quite literally the country of the South Slavs. Now, the country came together in 1918, and it incorporated a bewildering number of different religious traditions, different historical traditions, different national traditions, different ethnic groups, different national groups, and so on. I talked a little bit, hadn't I? When we looked at the interwar period, I'd explained that a lot of those new states like Czechoslovakia, states like Poland, had not been single states before the end of the First World War. They had been divided between empires. They had different historical experiences, and it was very difficult for the state makers of the interwar period to try to consolidate all of the different traditions, all of the different groups into one state. And you remember we talked about Masaryk and his conversations with Karel Čapek, and he was sort of saying, look, we need peace and we need quiet and we need time to achieve this consolidation. We have different groups. We have a German minority. We have Czechs. We have Slovaks. He was talking, of course, about Czechoslovakia. We need to be left alone in order to build a functioning state apparatus, a functioning bureaucracy, a functioning school system, a functioning army, a functioning taxation system, functioning politics that can bring all of these people together. Now, Yugoslavia, the country of the South Slavs, had these problems as well, but they were many times more serious than the cases of Czechoslovakia and Poland. And the reasons they were more serious is that there were many more different national groups. There were many more different historical experiences. In Yugoslavia, go back and check Rothschild's essay, which is available as an e-copy in the library, and then just read his sort of 20 or 30 pages. But you'll learn that there's a bewildering number, there of national groups. There are Serbs, there are Croats, there are Slovenes, there are Bosnian Muslims, so those people who converted in the Ottoman period. There were Albanians in the north of the country. There were Germans and Hungarians. There was a Jewish population throughout the country. All of these people had been living under different political systems. Some South Slavs had lived under the Habsburg Empire before the First World War. Serbia and Montenegro had once upon a time been under the Ottoman Empire, but in the 19th and the 20th centuries had decolonized and become independent national states. All of this was extremely complicated. All of these people came in with different expectations. All of these now found themselves living under a single roof, living under a single country. Now, probably the most important problem, the most of all of that, and I realize that this is one of those moments where you will probably have to pause the lecture, take a breath, and go back over what I've just said. Don't worry, there won't be a test on all of this dizzying and bewildering amounts of detail. Read Rothschild, and that will give you a great sort of overview of everything that's happening in this country after the First World War. Now, of course, unsurprisingly, just like elsewhere in the interwar period, the country did not fare extremely well politically. The 1920s were a period of parliamentary rule that failed, and in 1929, the country converted to a dictatorship, and the dictatorship was led by once upon a time, the Serbian king, now the Yugoslav king, a man called Alexander Karađorđević. And Alexander Karađorđević hoped that by imposing, his dictatorship, by imposing a very authoritarian rule upon the peoples of Yugoslavia, he would be able somehow to bring them all together. That he could get rid of the bickering of the 1920s, get rid of all of the problems of consolidation, and forcibly sort of meld all of these peoples into a single solid mass in going forwards in the 1930s. Now, despite strenuous efforts, he failed to do this, and indeed he was assassinated by a Croatian terrorist by a Croatian terrorist group in the 1930s, in 1934, and his dictatorship failed to bring the country together, and the country did not either come together in the 1930s. So it was an unhappy period in the interwar period, just like elsewhere in Eastern and Central Europe. So it was also the case in Yugoslavia. The country started out as a democracy. It descended into dictatorship in the 1930s. It experienced agrarian depression. It experienced economic depression. It experienced assassination. It experienced deep sort of divisions between the various national groups, and to all extents and purposes, the efforts to bring Yugoslavia together, to sort of summon all of the people into a single national identity, into a single Yugoslav identity, had failed. And the kind of governing ideas at the time, the overriding sense, was that this country had failed because of the domination of its largest national group, and that was the Serbs. Now, there was a sense that the interwar kingdom, that the interwar state of Yugoslavia had been brought down by the domineering position of the Serbs. And people would look at Karađorđević, look at Alexander, and say, well, he was a Serbian king. All of our prime ministers, except for one, were Serbs. The army was essentially a Serbian army. The bureaucracy was Serbian. The Serbians lorded it over us in this state, and that's one of the key reasons why we were never able to sort of create a common sense of Yugoslav identity. So this was the sort of the overriding sense of failure. Okay, now Yugoslavia was attacked, was put out of its misery in 1941. Hitler invaded using the Luftwaffe and the Wehrmacht, and the reason he did so, there are various reasons, but essentially, Hitler and Mussolini were waging war in Greece. He needed to sort of move his armies through the Balkans. There had been some sort of back and forth with the Yugoslav leadership, and eventually Hitler decided simply to smash this state wide open, to kind of punish it for standing up to him, to attack the state, to sort of bomb its cities. These are images of the capital, Belgrade, after being bombed by the Luftwaffe in 1941. And of course, Hitler, once upon a time, had been a Habsburg subject. He had been a subject of Austria-Hungary, and he had very keen memories of the way the war began in the Balkans, began in Bosnia, began with a Serbian terrorist, Gavrilo Princip, assassinating the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So he had a real kind of pathological hatred for the Serbs. He despised this sort of Balkan upstart nation. He wanted to punish them for stepping out of line, and indeed punish them he did in 1941 with this very kind of brutal military campaign, which was basically over in 6 days. The country was overrun, just as Czechoslovakia and just as Poland had been overrun before that. Okay, now once Hitler had occupied and invaded Yugoslavia, essentially sort of two things happened. The Nazis and the Italians imposed an occupation, dismembered Yugoslavia, broke it up into its constituent parts, and basically sort of occupied the Yugoslav lands. And if you remember what I'd said a couple of weeks ago in our sessions on the Second World War, Hitler was essentially interested in military routes. He was interested in economically exploiting this region. He was interested in sort of calm within the territory. He was just interested in keeping this sort of this territory quiet. So the country was occupied. But the experience of occupation opened up within Yugoslavia something like a civil war amongst the Yugoslavs themselves. So all of the bitternesses of the interwar period, all of the animosities about the dictatorship, about the Serbs, about the various sort of iniquities within the Yugoslav state, all of these sort of were magnified many times underneath occupation by the Italians and the Germans. The very worst elements, the most violent, the most warlike elements were brought to the surface within the country, and much of the trouble, much of the killing, much of the fighting within Yugoslavia from 1941 onwards was carried out by Yugoslavs against other Yugoslavs. So it wasn't Yugoslavs fighting against the occupier or collaborating with the occupier. There were people who did that, but in the largest part, these were people who were fighting. These were Yugoslavs who were fighting one against the other, and each of the various groups who were fighting were hoping that they would sort of emerge in this conflict victoriously. Now, there were three main groups in the Yugoslav civil war. I mean, there were many groups, and it was a very complicated picture, as war always is. But there were three main groups that we can talk about and that are worth remembering. The first group is in slide number 7, and that's a group that we've met very briefly already. The Croatian fascist movement, the Ustasha, headed by a man called Ante Pavelić. Now, the Ustasha in the 1930s had been an extreme Croatian nationalist terrorist paramilitary group. They had wanted the Croats to be independent. They had been passionately anti-Yugoslav, and they had hoped to break away from the Yugoslav state. They're a very small group, just a few hundred members in the 1930s, but they were infamous for carrying out grandiose terror attacks on the Yugoslav people and on the Yugoslav state. So bombing trains, for example, they bombed the Orient Express. In the 1930s, they attacked police stations. Most infamously at all, their crowning achievement in the middle of the 1930s was the assassination of the king, Alexander Karađorđević. Alexander was on a state visit in France, and the Ustasha hit squad was able to take him out and kill him, along with the French foreign minister, a man called Louis Bateau. Now, the Ustasha are very small, essentially a group of gangsters, a group of thugs, but they were put in charge of of a very large territory by Hitler during the Second World War, and I think I mentioned this territory in a couple of lectures ago. Pretty much all of Bosnia and large parts of Croatia as well. Now, because the movement was very small and because this movement was very vicious and very violent, very quickly they lost control of the territories that they were given. Pavelić tried to impose a very violent, a very drastic sort of revolutionary program. It tried to implement the Holocaust, tried to implement a program of genocide against the Serbian population in Bosnia and in Croatia. There were large Serbian minorities there. The whole thing collapsed into chaos, and very quickly Pavelić lost control of the country. And essentially the Ustasha, by sort of 1942, 1943, Pavelić and the Ustasha were really only able to control the capital, Zagreb, and even then, these various other groups that were about to meet were starting to close in on the Ustasha even there. So an incompetent group, a group very small, a group not capable of effectively and successfully governing the country, but nevertheless a group which created a huge amount of violence and bitterness, imposing these programs and attempting to sort of achieve genocide against minority groups, against political opponents, against the Serbs, against the Jews, against the Roma population, and killing many tens of thousands of people in the process. So creating a huge well of anger and a huge well of despair and animosity on path to losing control. So that was one group, the Ustasha. Now the second major group, the second force within the Yugoslav civil war is in slide number 8. This is a group known as the Chetniks. Now the Chetniks were the remnants of the interwar Royal Army. The army had been defeated very quickly within 6 days, as I mentioned earlier, but large numbers of soldiers and officers were still in the field. They had not been disarmed. They had actually not surrendered, and they had not left the country, unlike, for example, Czechoslovak and Polish armies in 1939. They were still on the ground, and there were some attempts to sort of organize this into a resistance force. And the movement was led by a Yugoslav army colonel, a man called Dragoljub Mihailović, or usually known by his nickname Draža Mihailović. And Mihailović disappeared into the mountains in central Serbia. And again, Balkans, lots of mountainous terrain, very good for sort of hiding, very good for secreting yourself. And Mihailović attempted to sort of gather as much force as possible, bring together the remnants of the Yugoslav army, and it was Mihailović's hope that one day, when the Axis powers were defeated, when the Germans were defeated, and Mihailović was certain that the Germans would eventually be defeated, they would be able to rise up and regain control of the country. So a little bit like the Polish Home Army, a little bit like that underground resistance movement, comprising national forces from the interwar period, but still with not haven't left the country, but still sort of on the ground fighting. Now, very quickly, the Chetniks essentially disappeared into only a Serbian movement. The Serbian, the Yugoslav army had always been dominated by men like Mihailovic, dominated by Serbian armies, and the Chetnik movement, at least, despite initially trying to make overtures outside of Serbia to Croats, to Slovenes, to Bosnians, was ultimately only a Serbian resistance movement. Now, the other thing is that Mihailovic could not really control his lieutenants. His men were scattered across the country, but particularly in Montenegro and in Bosnia. And there, his officers and his soldiers, or rather, Mihailovic did not have a huge amount of control over his men in places like Bosnia and places like Montenegro. He was not able to rein them in. He was not able to sort of impose some kind of military hierarchy of the kind that he had been used to. And many of these men were sort of not really thinking about conventional warfare. They were not thinking about the Yugoslav army. They were thinking back to the sort of the guerrilla traditions of the Ottoman period. There had been insurgent movements, guerrilla movements, bandit movements who fought against the Ottomans. And for many of these people associated with the Chetniks, this was the kind of warfare that should be waged, not a conventional war, but some kind of insurgent war. Now, they were, of course, in Bosnia and places like that, the Chetniks were confronting the Ustasha, and they were very horrified by what they were witnessing, horrified by the genocide, horrified by the sort of, the grandiose viciousness of Pavelic and his men and his fascist thugs. And as a result of this, they very often descended themselves into violence. And this violence often became sort of ethnically motivated. So the Serbian Chetnik movement started to attack Croat villages, started to attack Bosnian villages, started to attack basically anyone that wasn't Serbian. So they hopelessly compromised themselves. And even if Mihailovic himself had not been involved in a huge amount of violence, nevertheless, the Chetnik movement sort of disintegrated into something like a Serbian nationalist force, one that was guilty of committing massacres against non-Serbs, one that in the eyes of many people was not much better than the Ustasha. So two very violent movements, two movements contesting the civil war, but in doing so compromising themselves and compromising the vision of South Slav unity, of Yugoslav unity, that at least people had attempted to achieve in the interwar period. Now, the final force and the final force in the civil war, and ultimately the force that would emerge successfully, was the communist movement. Now, the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, we talked a little bit, didn't we, about the communists in our last sessions. And I told you that, the communists had been illegal during the interwar period. They had been hunted by the police. They had been hunted by the security forces. They had sort of really become essentially underground cells. They had become sort of like a clandestine movement, and this was pretty much true throughout all of the region, with the exception, of course, of Czechoslovakia, where the communist movement remained legal throughout the interwar period. So it was the same case in Yugoslavia. Initially, at the end of the First World War, the Yugoslav Communist Party, when it was formed at the beginning of the 1920s, had quite a lot of sort of domestic support. It had polled very well in the initial elections. It had been particularly popular in municipal elections in the bigger cities and the bigger towns in Yugoslavia, and it had quite a significant amount of support. But this had disintegrated early on. The communists had gone underground. A series of pieces of legislation had outlawed the communist movement. And by the middle of the 1920s, the Yugoslav Communist Party did not exist as